There is a particular kind of silence that follows humiliation, not the comfortable quiet of solitude, or the peaceful hush of a room after everyone has gone home. This silence is different. It lives in your chest. It wraps around your throat like a hand that never quite squeezes hard enough to leave bruises anyone else can see. I learned that silence intimately on a Tuesday afternoon in March, in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a building I had helped make profitable for 11 years. My name is Adaeze Okonkwo. I was born in Lagos, Nigeria, raised between the humidity of West Africa and the grey drizzle of Manchester, educated at Oxford and employed for over a decade by Whitmore Sterling, one of the most prestigious management consulting firms in the world. I had an MBA. I had a corner office. I had brought in more revenue than anyone in my division for 3 consecutive years. And none of that mattered in the moment when Bradley Whitmore III looked at me across a table of 20 executives and said, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'm sorry. Could someone translate? I genuinely cannot understand a word she's saying." The laughter that followed was not loud. That would have been easier. Loud laughter can be dismissed as crude, as obvious as the behavior of people who don't know better. This laughter was different. It was soft. It was knowing. It rippled through the room like water finding every crack in a foundation, and I watched it spread from face to face, some looking down at their notes, some pressing lips together as if holding back more, some not bothering to hide their amusement at all. I was presenting a proposal I had spent 4 months developing, a complete restructuring of our Asia-Pacific operations that would save the company $47 million over 5 years while expanding our market presence in 3 emerging economies. I had rehearsed it. I had refined every slide, every data point, every recommendation. I had practiced in front of mirrors and recorded myself and listened back, making sure my delivery was clear, my pace measured, my arguments airtight. But Bradley Whitmore III, grandson of the founder, heir apparent to nothing he had earned, promoted through the ranks on the strength of his last name and the weakness of everyone too afraid to challenge him, had decided that none of that mattered. What mattered was the way I pronounced certain vowels, the rhythm of my sentences, the fact that my accent carried traces of places he had never bothered to visit and people he had never bothered to understand. I stood there at the front of that conference room, laser pointer frozen in my hand, and I felt something shift inside me. Not break. That would come later in the privacy of my apartment, where I would sit in the dark and wonder how many years I had wasted believing that excellence was its own protection. No, in that moment, something shifted, like tectonic plates beginning, their slow, inevitable movement toward an earthquake no one sees coming. Perhaps, Bradley continued, leaning back in his chair with the easy confidence of someone who has never faced a consequence in his life, we should have someone else summarize the key points, someone whose communication skills are a bit more aligned with our corporate standards. I looked around the room, 20 faces, some I had worked with for years, some I had mentored, some I had hired, and not one of them spoke. Not one of them said, "Actually, I understood her perfectly." Not one of them said, "Bradley, that's inappropriate." Not one of them said anything at all. The person who finally broke the silence was Margaret Chen, the head of human resources, who cleared her throat and said, "Perhaps we should take a brief recess and reconvene in 15 minutes. And that was it. That was the defense. A recess, a polite pause, a corporate-approved way of sweeping humiliation under a rug already lumpy with all the things no one wanted to address. I gathered my materials. I walked out of that conference room with my spine straight and my face composed, because I learned long ago that the world watches women like me for signs of anger, for evidence that we are too emotional, too sensitive, too difficult. They want us to cry so they can dismiss us. They want us to rage so they can fear us. They want us to do anything that confirms the narrative that we don't belong. So I gave them nothing. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button for the lobby. I rode down 42 floors in perfect stillness, watching the numbers descend. And I did not allow myself to feel anything until I was 3 blocks away, standing in a small park I had never noticed in 11 years of walking past it, where I finally let my hands shake. But I didn't cry. I was done crying for people who didn't deserve my tears. The weeks that followed were an education in exactly how little protection 11 years of excellence actually provides. I filed a formal complaint with Human Resources. Margaret Chen took notes, nodded sympathetically, and told me she would look into it. 2 weeks later, I received an email informing me that an investigation had been conducted, and that while communication styles were acknowledged as an area for growth across the organization, no specific violation of company policy had been identified. The complaint was closed. No action taken. Meanwhile, Bradley Whitmore III continued to run meetings, make decisions, and collect a salary that was, I would later learn, nearly 3 times my own, despite bringing in a fraction of the revenue. He was untouchable, protected by the armor of his name and the complicity of everyone too comfortable to risk their own positions by challenging him. I watched my colleagues navigate around me like I had become contagious. Lunch invitations dried up. Meeting requests went unanswered. Projects I had been leading were quietly reassigned to others with vague explanations about bandwidth and strategic reallocation of resources. I was being erased, slowly, methodically, in ways that left no fingerprints. And through it all, I kept working. I kept producing. I kept generating revenue and solving problems and demonstrating my value in every measurable way. Because some stubborn part of me still believed that if I just performed well enough, they would have to acknowledge it. That belief was the last thing to die. It happened on a Thursday evening in June, when I was working late, as I often did, preparing for a presentation to a potential client worth $30 million in annual revenue. I was the lead on this pitch. I had spent 6 weeks building the relationship, crafting the proposal, understanding exactly what this client needed and how Whitmore Sterling could provide it. I heard voices in the hallway, Bradley's distinctive drawl, the sycophantic murmur of his usual entourage, and then my name. The Chen account, Bradley was saying, we need someone more polished on point, someone who actually sounds like they belong in a boardroom. But Adaeze has done all the groundwork, someone said. I recognized the voice, Christopher Wells, my own protege, someone I had mentored for 3 years. She knows this client better than anyone, which is why she'll still be involved. Behind the scenes, support role. We just need a different face on it, a different voice. Bradley laughed. You know how it is. Some clients are old-fashioned. They want to feel comfortable. And frankly, it's hard to feel comfortable when you're constantly trying to decipher what someone's saying. I waited for Christopher to push back, to defend me, to do what I had done for him countless times over the years. Yeah, Christopher said instead. I get it. Makes sense. Footsteps. Moving away. Laughter fading down the hall. I sat in my office in the dark for a long time after that. Not crying, not shaking, just still. Absolutely still. Like something inside me had finally reached its limit and simply stopped. They were going to take my work. They were going to put someone else's face on it. They were going to use everything I had built to advance careers that were not my own while I was pushed further and further into invisibility. And they expected me to accept it, to be grateful for the scraps, to keep my head down and my voice quiet, and my excellence unobtrusive. That was the night I made my decision. Not to leave. That would be too easy, too clean, too much like the graceful exit they were probably hoping for. No, I would stay. I would watch. I would wait. And I would remember every single person who had looked away, laughed along, or simply said nothing while they dismantled my career one silent betrayal at a time. Revenge is not a decision made in anger. Anger burns too hot and too fast. It consumes itself before it can consume anything else. True revenge requires something colder, something patient, something that can wait in darkness for exactly the right moment to step into the light. I had spent 11 years proving my worth to people who never intended to recognize it. Now I would spend however long it took proving something else entirely. The first thing I did was nothing. This is perhaps the hardest part of strategy, the discipline to resist immediate action, to observe rather than react, to gather information while appearing to accept defeat. For 3 months, I showed up to work. I took the assignments they gave me. I smiled in meetings and nodded along and never once let them see the machinery turning behind my eyes. But I watched. I listened. I collected. I learned that Bradley Whitmore III had been riding on his grandfather's reputation for so long that he had never actually developed any skills of his own. His presentations were written by junior analysts. His strategic insights were borrowed from consultants he never credited. His leadership consisted primarily of taking credit for others' work and avoiding responsibility for his own failures. I learned that the Whitmore Sterling partnership structure was vulnerable. The founding family's control was based on a voting bloc that required maintaining relationships with several key stakeholders, relationships that Bradley had systematically neglected in favor of golf outings and client dinners where he drank too much and said too little of value. I learned that there were others like me, Other talented people who had been sidelined, silenced, or pushed out entirely. Some had left the company quietly. Others had moved to competitors. A few were still here, buried in departments where their excellence could be exploited without ever being rewarded. I met with them, quietly, carefully. Coffee here, drinks there. Never anything formal, never anything that would raise suspicion. Just conversations between colleagues. Just the natural networking that everyone in consulting is expected to do. And I started to build something. It began as a loose coalition of the overlooked. People who had been passed over for promotions despite outperforming their peers. People who had watched less qualified colleagues advance on the strength of connections and demographics. People who, like me, had once believed that doing excellent work would be enough. We didn't call ourselves anything. We didn't have meetings with agendas or membership lists. We simply shared information, observed patterns, documented incidents that HR would never investigate and courts would never hear about because they were always just subtle enough to deny. And slowly, methodically, we began to identify the pressure points, the client relationships that depended entirely on specific people who were not Bradley Whitmore III, the financial irregularities that had been overlooked because no one wanted to audit the founding family's accounts, the quiet settlements that had been paid to employees who had left, suddenly and under circumstances no one discussed. I created a map, not a literal one, nothing that could be discovered or subpoenaed or used as evidence of planning. The map existed only in my mind, a constellation of weaknesses and connections and opportunities that grew more detailed with each passing month. And then, 6 months after that Thursday night in the dark of my office, I received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, formal, British, with the particular precision of someone trained in law. Ms. Okonkwo, this is Jeffrey Barnes, partner at Sterling & Associates. I'm calling regarding a matter of some significance, and I wonder if you might be available for a confidential meeting. Sterling & Associates. Not Whitmore and Sterling. The name was similar enough to cause confusion, but the firms were entirely unrelated. Sterling & Associates was a boutique investment firm that specialized in acquiring controlling interests in undervalued companies. Companies like Whitmore and Sterling, where decades of family mismanagement had created exactly the kind of vulnerability that sophisticated investors know how to exploit. I agreed to the meeting. Jeffrey Barnes turned out to be a small, precise man in his 60s, with the kind of expensive suit that suggests money so old it doesn't need to prove anything. We met in a private room at a hotel I had never visited, and he laid out the situation with the efficiency of someone who has made this kind of proposal many times before. A consortium of investors had identified Whitmore and Sterling as a target for acquisition. The firm was profitable but underperforming its potential, weighed down by legacy management practices and an executive structure that rewarded lineage over competence. The founding family's control was based on a complex arrangement of voting shares and partnership agreements, arrangements that had never been seriously challenged because no one with enough capital had ever been motivated to try. Until now. We've been watching the firm for some time, Jeffrey said, stirring his tea with the calm of someone discussing weather rather than corporate warfare. Watching certain dynamics unfold. The treatment of high-performing employees, the allocation of opportunities, the rather significant gap between the value created and the value recognized. He looked at me over the rim of his cup. We've been watching you in particular, Ms. Okonkwo. I felt my heart rate increase, but I kept my voice steady. And what exactly have you observed? Someone remarkable. Someone who has consistently outperformed her peers while being consistently undervalued. Someone who could have left years ago for a competitor willing to pay her what she's worth, but who has stayed, for reasons that might be simple loyalty, or might be something rather more interesting. He set down his cup. We're acquiring Whitmore and Sterling. The process will take approximately 18 months. When it's complete, there will be significant restructuring, new leadership, a complete reassessment of the executive team and their relative contributions. And you're telling me this because? Because the consortium would like you to be part of that new leadership. Specifically, we'd like you to become Chief Operating Officer, the person who will implement the restructuring, the face of the change that's coming. I was quiet for a long moment. The weight of what he was offering pressed against my chest like something physical. Why me? Jeffrey smiled. The first emotion he'd shown. Because you know where the bodies are buried, Ms. Okonkwo. Because you've been watching and waiting and preparing for an opportunity exactly like this one. And because we believe you'll do what needs to be done. And what exactly needs to be done? Clean house. Restore the firm to what it should have been all along. Ensure that excellence is rewarded and mediocrity is shown the door. I thought about Bradley Whitmore III and his mocking laughter. I thought about Margaret Chen and her closed investigation. I thought about Christopher Wells and his casual betrayal. I thought about every person who had looked away, stayed silent, or actively participated in my erasure. There's a meeting next month, I said slowly. The quarterly executive review. Bradley Whitmore III will be presenting the Asia-Pacific strategy, the one he stole from me. The entire senior leadership will be there. Yes, we're aware of the meeting. I want to be the one to tell them. Jeffrey's smile widened. We were rather hoping you'd say that. The next 18 months were the longest of my life. I continued to work at Whitmore Sterling, continued to take the assignments they gave me, continued to smile and nod and appear to accept my diminished role. But now I was working with purpose. Every document I accessed, every meeting I attended, every conversation I overheard, it all fed into the acquisition process, helping the consortium understand exactly what they were buying and what needed to change. I watched Bradley Whitmore III give presentations built on my work and receive praise he hadn't earned. I watched him promote people who flattered him and sideline people who challenged him. I watched him run the company into exactly the kind of underperformance that made hostile takeovers not just possible, but inevitable. And I waited. The acquisition was conducted through a series of intermediary companies, each purchasing small stakes in Whitmore Sterling's parent organization. By the time anyone noticed what was happening, it was too late. The consortium had achieved a controlling interest through routes so complex that the Whitmore family's lawyers spent 3 months trying to unravel them and failed. The final transaction was completed on a Monday. The announcement was scheduled for Wednesday, the day of the quarterly executive review. The day Bradley Whitmore III would present his stolen strategy to a room full of people who had no idea their world was about to end. I dressed carefully that morning. Navy suit, simple jewelry, the kind of quiet elegance that doesn't try too hard because it doesn't need to. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone I almost didn't recognize. Not wounded, not waiting, but ready. Finally ready. I arrived at the office early and went directly to my usual desk in the corner of the building, where they had moved me after my complaint. The space they had assigned to signal my irrelevance. I sat there for an hour, answering emails, reviewing files, acting as if this were any other day. At 10 o'clock, I walked to the 42nd floor. The conference room was already filling when I arrived. I took a seat at the back, my usual position now, far from the power center of the table where I had once sat as a matter of course. I watched my former colleagues file in, checking phones, making small talk, arranging themselves according to the invisible hierarchies that governed every aspect of this place. Bradley Whitmore III arrived last, as he always did. A power move that only works if you actually have power. He swept into the room with his usual entourage, nodded to his allies, ignored everyone else, and took his position at the head of the table. Right then, he said, clapping his hands together. Let's get started. I'll be presenting our Asia-Pacific strategy. Exciting stuff. Really groundbreaking work from the team. He caught my eye briefly and smiled. A dismissive smile. A smile that said, I know you know, and I know you can't do anything about it. I smiled back. Actually, I said, my voice carrying across the room with perfect clarity, no hesitation, no accommodation, every vowel exactly as I had always pronounced it. There's been a change to the agenda. The room went quiet. Heads turned. Bradley's smile faltered. I'm sorry, he laughed. The condescending sound I knew so well. I don't recall inviting. Bradley, I stood. I think you'll want to hear this. The door to the conference room opened. Jeffrey Barnes entered, followed by 3 other representatives from Sterling & Associates. They positioned themselves along the back wall, their presence formal and unmistakable. What is this? Bradley's voice rose slightly. Who are these people? Security? As of 9 o'clock this morning, I said, walking slowly toward the front of the room, Sterling & Associates completed their acquisition of a controlling interest in Whitmore Sterling's parent company. The firm is under new ownership. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. That's impossible, Bradley sputtered. My family controls. Your family controlled 62% of voting shares through a network of trusts and holding companies. Over the past 18 months, that control was systematically diluted through a series of acquisitions you were too busy taking credit for other people's work to notice. I reached the front of the room and turned to face the table, 20 faces stared back at me. Some confused, some frightened, some, and I noted every single one, already calculating how to position themselves. The new ownership has appointed me as Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately. I will be leading a comprehensive restructuring of the firm's leadership and operational practices. You can't, Bradley started. Let me be clear about what this means. I continued as if he hadn't spoken. Performance will be evaluated, contributions will be documented, people will be promoted, reassigned, or separated from the company based on one criterion and one criterion only, their actual value to this organization. I looked at Christopher Wells, who couldn't meet my eyes. For some of you, this restructuring will be an opportunity, a chance to finally be recognized for the work you've been doing without acknowledgement. I looked at Margaret Chen, whose face had gone pale. For others, it will be a reckoning, a chance to explain exactly how you prioritized comfort over fairness, silence over justice, career preservation over basic decency. Finally, I looked at Bradley Whitmore III. He was standing now, his face flushed, his hands shaking with the particular tremor of someone who has never faced a consequence and doesn't know how to process the experience. And for a few of you, I said quietly, this will be the end. You can't do this. His voice cracked. You don't have the authority. I believe, I said, allowing myself a small smile, that you once told this room you couldn't understand a word I was saying, that my communication skills weren't aligned with corporate standards. I paused. Are you having trouble understanding me now? The silence in the room was absolute. No soft laughter this time. No knowing looks exchanged between allies. Just the weight of 20 people realizing simultaneously that the world had shifted under their feet. Let me make my communication extremely clear then. I turned to address the entire room, my voice carrying every trace of every place I had ever been. Lagos and Manchester and Oxford and every space between. Every accent that had ever been used as evidence of my inadequacy now transformed into something else entirely. Authority, presence, power that had never been given, only finally claimed. This firm, under my leadership, will no longer reward mediocrity dressed in privilege. It will no longer punish excellence for the sin of coming in the wrong package. It will no longer be a mechanism for advancing the undeserving at the expense of the talented. Those days are over. I looked at each face in turn, cataloging every response, every flicker of fear or calculation or hope. Bradley Whitmore III is terminated, effective immediately. His office is to be cleared by end of day. Security will escort him from the building. You can't, Bradley started, again. Margaret Chen, I turned to her. You are suspended pending a full review of HR practices over the past 5 years. I will be particularly interested in complaints that were dismissed without adequate investigation. Margaret's mouth opened and closed without sound. Christopher Wells, my former protege, finally looked at me. In his eyes, I saw recognition, not just of my authority, but of what he had done, what he had failed to do. You will be reassigned to a junior analyst position while we evaluate whether you have the character to remain with this organization at all. I suggest you use this time for some serious reflection on the difference between loyalty and sycophancy. I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. For everyone else, detailed evaluations will be conducted over the coming weeks. I encourage you to be honest about your contributions and your conduct. I encourage you to remember that I have been watching this organization for a very long time, and I have an excellent memory. Jeffrey Barnes stepped forward. Ms. Okonkwo, whenever you're ready, the board would like to formally welcome you. I nodded, then turned back to the room one final time. 2 years ago, in this very conference room, I was standing at this same spot, presenting a strategy I had developed over 4 months of careful work. A strategy that would have saved this company millions. A strategy that was subsequently stolen and presented as the work of others. I looked at Bradley, who was being quietly surrounded by security personnel. That day, I was mocked. My accent, my voice, the way I communicate. I was dismissed as someone who didn't belong, someone who couldn't be understood, someone whose excellence was less important than the comfort of people who had never earned their positions. I straightened my jacket, adjusted my posture, felt the weight of this moment settle into my bones like something I would carry for the rest of my life. Let me tell you something about accents. Every accent is the sound of survival. It is the music of every place a person has been, every language they've learned, every world they've navigated. My accent is Lagos and Manchester and Oxford and every conference room where I've had to be twice as good to be considered half as qualified. My accent is the sound of a journey most of you cannot imagine. I moved toward the door, toward my new future, toward everything that was finally beginning. And if you couldn't understand me, the failure was never mine. It was always yours. The restructuring took 4 months. In that time, I reviewed the performance of every executive, every manager, every person in a position of authority. I discovered what I had always suspected, that the people with the most impressive titles were often those with the least impressive contributions, and that the engine of this firm had always been driven by people who were never acknowledged, never promoted, never given the opportunity to lead. I changed that. I promoted 3 people who had been systematically overlooked despite exceptional performance. I created a task force to address patterns of discrimination that had been documented but never acted upon. I implemented new evaluation criteria that focused on measurable outcomes rather than subjective assessments of fit and potential. Bradley Whitmore III tried to sue. His lawyers withdrew from the case after reviewing the documentation of his conduct that had been quietly accumulated over years by people he had dismissed as unimportant. There was enough evidence of hostile work environment, discriminatory practices, and misappropriation of intellectual property to ensure he would never work in consulting again. Margaret Chen resigned before I could fire her. Her departure package included a clause requiring her silence about certain matters that might otherwise have made their way into legal proceedings. She would never work in HR again, but she would also never have to face public accountability for her failures. Some part of me regretted this compromise, but I was learning that power requires choices, and not every choice can be perfect. Christopher Wells sent me a letter. Handwritten, 3 pages. An apology that seemed genuine, though genuineness is hard to assess from people who showed so little of it when it mattered. I read it once and filed it away. Perhaps I would consider his future with the firm, perhaps not. Time would tell whether his remorse was real or merely strategic. 6 months after the acquisition was complete, I stood in the same conference room where I had once been humiliated, addressing a new executive team, one that I had assembled, one that reflected the actual diversity of talent and perspective that the firm had always possessed but never empowered. I want to be clear about the culture we're building here, I said. This is not a revenge project. This is not about punishing people for their past behavior. It is about creating an environment where excellence is recognized, where contribution is valued, and where no one is ever made to feel that their voice, the actual sound of their voice, the accent that carries their history, is less worthy of being heard. I looked around the room at faces that represented 6 countries, a dozen languages, and a lifetime of perspectives that had never before been present at this table. Some of you were here during the old regime. Some of you watched what happened to me and said nothing. I am not asking for your apologies. I am asking for your commitment. Prove that you understand what this organization should be. Prove that you're capable of recognizing excellence when it doesn't look or sound exactly like you expected. Prove that you're worthy of sitting at this table. I paused. And if you can't prove those things, I will find people who can. It has been 2 years now since that day in the conference room. 2 years since I looked Bradley Whitmore in the eye and watched his world collapse around him. 2 years since I began the work of transformation, not just of a company, but of myself. I think often about that woman who stood at the front of this same room, presenting a brilliant strategy to people who couldn't be bothered to listen. I think about her careful preparation, her measured words, her stubborn belief that excellence would eventually be recognized if she just kept proving herself. She was not wrong to believe those things, but she was incomplete. She understood that she was exceptional. She did not yet understand that exceptionality without power is just potential waiting to be exploited. That in a world designed to overlook people like her, being good would never be enough. She would also need to be strategic, patient, willing to wait for the right moment and then, when it arrived, absolutely ruthless in seizing it. I am not the same woman who stood in that room 2 years ago. I am not wounded anymore. I am not waiting. I am not performing my excellence for people who were never going to recognize it. I am something else now, something that was forged in humiliation and tempered in patience, and finally allowed to emerge when the conditions were right. Some people say revenge changes you. They're not entirely wrong. But the change is not what they imagine. Revenge does not make you cruel. It does not make you cold. It does not transform you into some mirror image of those who hurt you. What revenge does, when it is executed properly, with precision and patience and complete clarity of purpose, is reveal you. It burns away the accommodations and the performances and the endless adjustments you made to fit into spaces that were never designed for you. It shows you who you were always capable of becoming, if only the world had been willing to see it. I did not become the chief operating officer of Whitmore Sterling because I was angry. I became the chief operating officer because I was exceptional, and because I finally stopped waiting for other people to acknowledge that exceptionality on their terms. The firm is thriving now, more profitable than it has ever been, more diverse, more innovative, more worthy of the talent we have always possessed and finally know how to use. And I sit in my office on the 42nd floor, a corner office, larger than the one I had before, with windows that look out over a city that never stops moving. And I think about the sound of my own voice. My accent has not changed. It still carries Lagos and Manchester and Oxford and every journey in between. When I speak in meetings, people listen. Not because I have modulated my voice to match some arbitrary standard of corporate acceptability. Not because I have smoothed away the traces of my history to make others more comfortable. They listen because when I speak, I am worth listening to. They always were listening to someone worth hearing. The only difference is that now, they know it. Sometimes new employees ask me about my path to leadership. They want to know the secret. They want to understand how I went from corner desk to corner office, from overlooked analyst to chief operating officer. I tell them the truth, or at least part of it. I tell them that excellence matters, but so does strategy. That being good at your job is necessary but not sufficient. That they must watch and learn and understand the systems they're operating within, and then decide whether to change those systems from the inside or burn them down and build something better. I tell them that their accents, their backgrounds, their differences, these are not weaknesses to be overcome. They are sources of perspective and strength that others lack. The very things that might make them targets are also the things that make them irreplaceable. And I tell them one thing more, something I learned in the hardest way possible. I tell them to pay attention to who speaks up when injustice occurs and who stays silent, to note who laughs along with cruelty and who refuses, to remember every person who looks the other way when they could have looked directly at what was happening and said no, because someday, somehow, the wheel will turn, power shifts, circumstances change. And when that moment comes, when they find themselves in a position to determine the fates of those who once determined theirs, they will want to remember who deserves grace and who deserves exactly what they gave. This is not cruelty. This is simply memory, simply consequence, simply the natural result of a universe that eventually tends toward balance. I don't know if Bradley Whitmore III ever understood what happened to him. I don't know if he ever connected the dots between that Tuesday afternoon when he mocked a woman for the sound of her voice and the Wednesday morning 18 months later when that same woman ended his career with perfect clarity and complete composure. I hope he did. Not because I need him to suffer, but because I want him to learn. I want him to understand that every act of casual cruelty plants a seed, and some of those seeds grow into trees tall enough to block out his sun entirely. But if he never understood, that's acceptable too. My satisfaction does not depend on his comprehension. My peace does not require his acknowledgement. I have already received everything I needed from this story. Not revenge, though that was satisfying. Not power, though that was necessary. Not even justice, though that came closer to what I was seeking. What I received was simpler and more profound. I received myself, the self I had been burying under accommodations and performances and the endless work of making others comfortable with my presence. The self that had always been there, waiting to emerge when I finally stopped asking permission. There is a particular kind of silence that follows reclamation, not the crushing quiet of humiliation or the tense hush of a room about to hear bad news. This silence is different. It is peaceful. It is earned. It is the sound of a story that has finally reached its proper ending. I sit in my office now, in that peaceful silence, and I listen to the city below, traffic and construction and millions of lives being lived with their own dramas and injustices and moments of transformation. Somewhere down there, someone is being overlooked. Someone is being dismissed. Someone is learning in the hardest way possible that being excellent is not enough protection against people determined not to see your excellence. I cannot save all of them. I cannot restructure every unjust system or remove every person who uses power to diminish others. But I can do what I can do. I can run this organization with the values I always believed it should have. I can create spaces where voices like mine are not just tolerated, but celebrated. I can demonstrate every day that there is another way, that power does not have to mean cruelty, that success does not require stepping on others, that it is possible to rise without pushing anyone else down. And I can remember, that is perhaps the most important thing. I can remember what it felt like to be dismissed, so that I never dismiss others. I can remember the silence of colleagues who should have spoken, so that I always speak when it matters. I can remember the long patience of waiting for my moment, so that I recognize others who are waiting for theirs. Power is not taken, I have learned. It is revealed. It was always there, inside us, waiting for the moment when we stop asking for permission and simply claim what we have earned. I earned this. Every meeting I sat through, every presentation I delivered, every hour of work that was credited to someone else, it all led here, to this office, this title, this opportunity to build something better than what came before. Bradley Whitmore III is gone now. Margaret Chen is gone. Christopher Wells is still here, working his way back from disgrace, demonstrating whether his remorse was genuine or merely strategic. The old guard has largely scattered, replaced by people who understand that the rules have changed, and I remain. The woman they couldn't understand, the voice they tried to silence, the excellence they refused to see. I remain, and I remember, and I build. That's the thing about revenge in the end. It is not about destroying your enemies. It is about becoming yourself so completely that their opinion of you becomes irrelevant. It is about rising so high that their voices can no longer reach you. It is about creating a world where people like them have no power, and people like you, like us, are finally, fully seen. I look out my window at the city that never stops moving, and I allow myself a small smile. They mocked my accent in that corporate meeting. They laughed at the sound of my voice, at the rhythm of my words, at everything that made me who I am. And then I introduced myself as their new vice president, and the room froze, not because they feared me, not because they hated me, but because in that moment, they finally understood something they should have known all along. I was always going to end up here. The only question was whether they would be standing beside me or swept away in my wake. They made their choice, and I made mine. And now, in the silence of this office, in the peace of this ending, I am exactly where I was always meant to be. The woman who rose from the ashes of dismissal, not by changing who she was, but by finally, fully becoming her. The woman with the accent they couldn't understand, speaking in a voice they will never forget. The woman who won, not because revenge made her strong, but because she had always been strong, and revenge simply gave her the stage to prove it. This is my story, this is my reclamation. This is the sound of my voice, carrying every place I have ever been, speaking the only truth that ever mattered. I am here, I am capable, I am worthy, and I am no longer waiting for anyone's permission to say so. Permission to say so. Permission to say so. Permission to say so. Permission to say